Okay. So TCM, we run regular webinars. I know some of you here today have been on some of our webinars, and we run events and activities. We've been around for 14 years, and our proposition really is to help organisations achieve their full potential by removing the barriers of conflict, change, and communication breakdown. And we help organisations do that in a proactive way by training leaders and managers to spot conflicts early, to nip them in the bud. We help HR professionals redefine and remodel their dispute resolution systems. And I guess what we're really famous for is setting up internal mediation schemes and delivering mediation services. So we set up over 300 integrated resolution schemes in organisations across the UK, from Royal Mail, Marks and Spencer's, banks, Whitehall departments, and many others. And we've gained real expertise and knowledge of how to embed mediation into cultures where mediation perhaps hasn't been seen as a normal or mainstream activity in the past. And we have a fantastic team here delivering the services and support for our customers. We created the famous Fair Mediation Framework. That's the standard mediation model in the UK, used by over 4,000 organisations. Facilitate, appreciate, innovate, resolve the FAIR framework. And we are accredited by Customer First, a real commitment to customer at the centre of everything we do at TCM. So that's a little bit about the business. My background is 20 years in the field of non-violence and dispute resolution, with the last 15 years promoting these approaches within organisations. And I've seen a real growth in the role of mediation within HR processes, leadership programs, and across organisations. Mediation is clearly a mainstream activity within the vast majority of organisations who do use it now. So for those, I'm just getting a few comments here from one or two of you. So will the presentation be made available afterwards? Absolutely. A number of you have done sound checks. I think Samantha, you've done a sound check. Hopefully you can hear us now. The sound is working. We've done sound tests here, so it may well be at your end there. But if you just double check your sound settings, it is being recorded, so we will send you a recording of this. But hopefully you can hear us okay. So the hot topics today. So what causes conflict? Why do conflicts happen? I guess we'll look at mediation. Sorry, conflict as a ubiquitous aspect of any organisation. We've all experienced conflict at some point in our lives. Organisations will experience conflict, but why does it happen? How does it happen? And when does it happen? How does it unfold? Why does conflict happen? How do these issues escalate? What's the spark that causes the confrontation between the parties? What's the impact of that? And also then, how can we start to reduce conflict, reduce the stress and the absence and the negativity that's often associated with conflict, and transform it from a destructive aspect of our organisations into something more constructive and useful, in the way that Royal Mail have done, in the way that they tackle bullying and harassment and promote better industrial relations within their organisation. We'll also look at how to measure the value and benefits of mediation, and looking at the integration of mediation within the organisation and within the business. So our first presentation is from Jonny Gifford, the CIPD researcher and specialist in employee relations, who's going to talk to us about the employee's perspective and tracing the employee's perspective of workplace conflict. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jonny, and I'll just change presenters, and hopefully we'll see Jonny's slides come up now, and he will be able to present his presentation to us. So Jonny, over to you, and thank you, Jonny, so much for participating in today's webinar.
Pleasure. Can you see my screen now? Okay, I'm hoping you can. Okay, so yes, I'm Jonny Gifford. I'm a research advisor at the CIPD, and I'm going to talk about some recent research that we've been conducting on workplace conflict. There's two parts to the research that we've been doing. Firstly, rather than just look at the worst cases of conflict, such as those that get to mediation or tribunal, what we wanted to do was to understand more about the whole range of interpersonal conflict at work, how it's manifest, how it unfolds, and to gauge what sort of impact that it has. So to do that, we conducted a representative survey of UK employees on conflict that they'd experienced in the last year, and that's going to be the main focus of my presentation now. And secondly, we talked to employers, basically HR managers, about how they approach conflict management, and we looked at how this is shifting. I should say that the research that I'm talking about is available on our website. We can put a link, but if you Google "getting under the skin of conflict," you should find both reports there. So in terms of incidents then of conflict, what proportion of employees in our country would you say have had a interpersonal conflict at work in the last year? It turns out that it's about 2 in 5 of us. So this is all UK employees, 38% feel that they've had some form of interpersonal conflict at work. 2 things that we're defining as conflict here. So firstly, isolated disputes or incidents of conflict, and secondly, ongoing difficult relationships. So that 38% comprises either or both of these. And you can see a pretty even split between the two, and you can see that there's some overlap. So if about 3 in 10 of us say we've had difficult relationships in the last year, a third of that number would have also had isolated bust-ups, if you like. What do people count as conflict? What do we mean by conflict? Well, the most common behaviour that was referenced was a lack of respect. So that was 3 in 5 employees who've experienced conflict talked about a lack of respect. And unsurprisingly, the more serious behaviours are rarer, but they're still there. How serious, though, is this? I mean, in terms of the impact, you can see in this slide that the greatest impact is in employees' well-being. So 2 in 5 cases of conflict, people were talking about it leading to stress or hitting their motivation or their commitment to work. But you can also see that there are some fundamental business issues being affected here. So 1 in 7 of us experiencing conflict saying it affected their productivity, it affected how workable the relationships. So business leaders, should really take note here. If you think about this in overall terms, we're talking about 5% of UK employees, of all UK employees, who've had a drop in productivity due to conflict just in the last year. Of course, not everyone experiences and deals with conflict in the same way. So if we take gender, first of all, although men and women are equally likely to experience conflict in the workplace, and just as likely to feel that specific cases are resolved, there are some notable differences. So firstly, in the type of conflict, men are more likely to have isolated disputes or clashes, as opposed to the ongoing difficult relationships. Women are also more likely to find conflict stressful, and in terms of how we deal with conflict, women are more likely to discuss it outside of work with friends or members of their family. Women are also more likely to say that they've felt bullied or harassed, although this doesn't seem to be a pure gender issue, because when we control for sector, like the organisational sector, this difference disappears because bullying and harassment is viewed as more common in the public sector. So turning then to organisational differences, we do find that conflict is more common in public sector organisations than private, but this difference shrinks massively when we control for the size of the workforce. So like for like, in organisational size, conflict is only slightly more common in public sector organisations. What's much more influential is organisational size itself. And it's really interesting to see where the cut-off point is here. The difference is not so much between medium and large organisations, or even between small and medium organisations. The difference is with micro-organisations. So as soon as you look beyond this to organisations with 10 or more employees, it seems that the structures, the procedures are in place, not to mention competing teams and silos. And what this does is to make conflict more likely in the first place and harder to resolve as a result. So how do we respond to conflict and try and resolve it? We ask people about a wide range of approaches. So from the more formal, including grievance and disciplines as well as tribunals, to talking to the boss or talking to HR, through to informally just talking with the other person. And also, as I mentioned, we ask people about talking to people outside of work, friends or members of their family. And then we also had this other item where we said, I didn't do anything, I just let it go. So attaching some figures to this, you can see that 1 in 10 of us take a formal approach, mainly internally, grievance and disciplines. The most common approach was to talk to one's boss or to HR, and then the others is about 1 in 4 of us. The most effective approaches, so these are the approaches that were most strongly correlated with a satisfactory resolution, how well we felt that the conflict had been resolved. The most effective approaches were the formal approach on the one hand and the informal talking to people directly on the other hand. So the first and the third of those pictures there. The interesting thing with talking to friends or members of the family is that this is associated with less effective resolution of conflict. So what it seems is that many of us will tend to offload to people outside of work instead of dealing with the actual problem itself. So it's maybe a case of complaining to the wrong person. I mean, what's clear is that doing nothing is the worst way to deal with conflict. But it's interesting that even this talking to friends and family is associated with it. And linking this to the gender differences that I was talking about before, it seems that for women in particular, who are more likely to talk to friends and family about it, for women in particular, it's important that organisations develop a culture where it feels relatively safe to deal directly and openly with conflict. Okay, so what about mediation? Well, we had very small numbers of people who'd experienced conflict and had actually used mediation as a result. And unfortunately, these small numbers meant that there wasn't a great deal of analysis that we could do on things like its impact. But the numbers themselves are interesting, and interesting to compare that we find there's almost 10 times the number of people who say that they would have personally benefited from mediation, and far more, nearly half of us, who think that mediation is an effective tool. And that's substantially more than the numbers of employers, when we've asked them, the numbers of employers who say they've used mediation in the last year. But this is becoming more common. Employers are using both external mediation but also internal mediation. In particular, in fact, they're taking this DIY approach of training line managers in having difficult conversations, having facilitated discussions from HR, and also training up sort of specific internal mediators. External mediation is quite a bit rarer, but still, becoming more common. I think that in terms of the growth areas, as employers see it, the biggest areas for growth are in training line managers. And in a way, I think that this fits well with our view that the best way to nip conflict in the bud is to develop the people skills and develop the culture that makes it more natural to have direct, frank conversations, and to do so in a skilled way, in a safe way that doesn't escalate. So, some key points then from me to summarize. Well, conflict is relatively common. 2 in 5 of us saying that we've experienced it just in the last year, and it's clearly something that's of real importance. It's something which affects business outcomes, productivity, commitment, as well as individuals' well-being. The smallest organisations seem that there's something we can learn from them in the less formal structures that they have, in particular, more direct ways that, and the more immediate ways that they'll try to nip conflict in the bud. Conflict is, clearly best resolved if it's dealt with directly. Interestingly, though, we find that there's a case for keeping formal procedures as well as developing the informal. But there is clearly this lack of access to mediation, even though we've got sort of about 3 in 10 employers saying that they're using it. There are more people who would want access to mediation than currently have it. So that's me, and I will hand back to you, David.
Jonny, thank you so much. I realised I was still on mute there. So, Jonny, thank you so much for your presentation. And you've thrown down some real challenges and thrown down the gauntlet for a great many organisations. Jonny, I'm particularly interested, given mediation is so successful and over 90% of cases reach a successful outcome through mediation, why do you think the uptake is so low for organisations? For me, it seems like the obvious answer. Let's sit in a room, let's talk, let's listen, let's build a bridge of understanding, and let's find an outcome between us. And seeing such a low uptake of mediation seems really interesting to me. Was there any thoughts about why that is and what might happen to resolve that?
I would say, 2 things. One is the relative novelty of mediation as a tool in the workplace, but also I think that there is, without doubt, a reliance on formal procedures because it's within the comfort zone. As I say, it's relatively early in the stage of growth of organisations that these formal structures come in and limit the way in which we can deal with things directly and informally. And I think that it feels safe for people, both employees and people working in HR and managers alike, to deal with things in a formal way. I think this isn't, not least the case because of the fear of litigation. So there's a fear that you've got to follow everything by the book. But also, I think it's just, the comfort zone. It's where many people, line managers and people working in HR, are used to dealing with things is through procedure, standard, processes. So Jonny, are you suggesting that the HR policies and procedures that exist in our organisations to resolve these issues, paradoxically, are actually inhibiting their resolution? Because I think that's a really interesting challenge to HR professionals, to be able to take a step back and look at those policies and procedures. Because in some respects, if those policies and procedures are there to protect employees, protect the employer, and create healthy, productive and high-performing relationships, is there not an argument that those very same policies and procedures actually are impeding creativity, generating division and promoting confrontation? That may be the case. In some instances. I think one thing that I have to highlight is that people who'd used formal procedures like grievance and disciplines, we found that they were more likely to feel that they'd reached a better resolution as a result of it. That's compared to people who did nothing. So compared, at the very least, we can say that compared to doing nothing, you are better off using a formal procedure. But I think that when we dig a bit deeper into the data, there's two things that are clear. One is that there's a bit of horses for courses. So there's different procedures are useful for different cases, or different procedures are most often used in different types of conflict. So that may be different types of conflict regarding who the conflict is with, whether it's with your colleague, or whether it's with a line manager or someone else in the organization, for example, and also in terms of what the conflict is focused on. But I think that the overall message that I would want to put out from our research aligns, relatively closely to yours, which is that although we wouldn't say get rid of the formal procedures right now, what we would say is that there is a clear gap, that we need informal mediation type procedures as well as grievance and discipline, more formal type approaches. And organisations have they've got the formal approaches covered off. So they've got all of that. And where they're lacking is in having some sort of alternative approach that deals with things in a different way, maybe suited for different types of conflict. But it's without that mediation or something along the lines of mediation, you've got a dangerously incomplete procedure for dealing with conflict effectively.
Jonny, absolutely fantastic, really, really interesting, throwing down some real challenges. And I guess when I'm working with organisations, the challenge for the HR professional is, does procedural fairness and procedural justice trump common sense? And when I'm looking at the policies and procedures in our organisations that we've applied since the 1970s of trying to resolve these issues, in my experience as a mediator working with over 4,000 organisations, is unfortunately the policies and procedures are such that we reduce the risk of harm to the employer and the risk of escalation into the employment tribunal and through formal processes, but what they don't seek to do is actually resolve the issue at root cause. And therefore, in some respects, those policies and procedures are more around dispute escalation than dispute resolution. And I absolutely agree, they're central to an effective organisation around fairness, around treating people equally, with respect and with dignity. But they aren't the only way of addressing these issues, and for too long we've become reliant on one size-fits-all approaches. I think Jane Gold, you sum it up in your comment here. My experience is that people are fearful of talking honestly. It's the bogeyman, Jane. This is what we're scared of. The bogeyman's going to get you. We've become so reliant on policies and procedures and processes. They are vital, as we've been hearing Jonny saying, but they impede common sense. I remember talking to an HR professional investigating two managers' grievances that they brought against each other, and she said to those two managers, if you talk to each other during the course of the investigation, you will be subject to disciplinary action. And my reaction as a mediator was, the world has gone mad. Those two managers should have been put in a room with a skilled third party and given ample opportunity to resolve their issues. By following due process, which I completely understood, we'd actually impeded any opportunity for dialogue and collaboration and some consensus building. I know that's an extreme example, but I think when I look at organisations, there are many, many examples like that. Those policies and procedures, we have to go into grievance in order to be able to generate the dispute resolution process. We know that I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I attack, you defend, I attack. There's a polarity, it's binary justice. And those policies and procedures actually encourage binary justice. They're intrinsically adversarial, creating a fear of anxiety, a fear of what can happen, repercussion. And in so doing, we suppress the conflict. But we don't suppress the conflict just within the teams, we suppress it in ourselves. And that's why we see the irritable bowel syndrome, the bad backs, the bad shoulders, the bad knees, the bad ankles, the bad everything. It's damaging, not just on a psychological element, on a physiological element. And these are the people who are unlocking innovation in your company right now. They're at home watching Homes Under the Hammer. You cannot unlock innovation in your company and drive competitive advantage by watching Homes Under the Hammer. We need people in the workplace resolving their issues, talking constructively, meaningfully and positively to find positive outcomes. But we don't actually know what this is costing us. I go into organisations and run diagnostics and tools, and the figures that are presented to the board as part of the business case are often shocking and in many cases very surprising. Yet this is a key aspect of our organisations. We need to become much better at measuring this. What's the cost of conflict? What's the impact? How much time and money are we spending on these issues? How much do we spend at employment tribunal? How much are settlement agreements costing us? Interestingly, another piece of research launched this week by Expert HR in partnership with Personnel Today suggested that 70% of all settlement agreements are issued because of relationship breakdown. Surely we should be doing something much sooner, much earlier, much more effectively. We find that the holy trinity of the organisation, HR, management and unions, unlike in Royal Mail, as we'll hear in a moment, whilst they have a really important role to play, they're pulling in three different directions. And do you know who falls through the middle? It's the employee. Now, if these holy trinity can pull together in a combined and unified way to address these issues with the employee at the centre of this, surely that's a fairer, more effective, more sustainable, more powerful way of addressing these issues. And we know leadership is effing tough. And don't worry, I'm not going to swear on a public webinar. Feelings, frustrations, fights, fear, the real F's of the modern workplace. And leaders, and again, another interesting piece of research that was published today was in relation to graduates' attitudes to soft skills. We know from the McDonald's report and the Back in Soft Skills campaign that very few organisations invest in soft skills for tackling these issues, listening, empathy, building strong, coherent teams. But in the absence of that, our people are disengaged. Again, drawing on more research, according to Engage for Success, only 30% of our employees are engaged at any one moment in time. Nita Clark and David McLeod, who I know well, tell us that a breakdown in trust is the antithesis of employee engagement. Organisations, they leave it too late. They throw money at problems that should be resolved at a much earlier stage. In many respects, when I talk about conflict management, people automatically think about employment tribunal. They don't think about the quarrel and the spat in the distribution centre, in the ward, in the clinic, in the office. That's where we should be resolving those issues. And another key point I'd like to make here, and it's a really, really important point, is we're scared to death of conflict. It's almost seen as the natural, inevitable, but rather unpleasant fallout of people working together. And HR are given a dustpan and brush and told, go and sweep up this mess. But in actual fact, that for me misses the trick. If we can understand what conflict is, we'd recognise it can be a powerful and positive contributor to our organisations. So before I hand over to Jane to talk about the Royal Mail experience, let's just focus on what it is. Organisations are very good at focusing on the destructive behaviours. We have policies and procedures for every single destructive behaviour that one of your employees could do, and we can dream up a few that they might not do, and we'll write a policy on that. But in actual fact, where those destructive behaviours are coming from is our needs aren't being met. They need to be valued, respected, taken seriously, treated as an equal within my team. And when we don't have our needs met, we experience a profound sense of loss, a loss of hope, a loss of esteem, a loss of confidence, a loss of control. Martin Seligman, the psychologist, the founder of the School of Positive Psychology, tells us that a loss of control is one of the biggest causes of stress and anxiety for human beings. So we then feel we get into the conflict zone, the fight, flight, freeze or fall zone. This rush of powerful hormones, adrenaline, cortisol and others fired off by the amygdala in our brain, locking us into these negative cycles, which then impact on our actions, interactions and reactions. And what we do as organisations is we just focus on the destructive behaviours. In mediation, we focus on what are the real causes of these. And do you know what's really interesting is we could be talking to an employee about feeling disrespected, not communicated with, not treated with dignity. The other party says, I'm not feeling respected, I'm not being communicated with, I'm not treated with dignity. Both parties often have the shared experience and unmet needs, but they've lost sight of that because they dehumanise each other. Well, an organisation that's bringing some humanity back to its dispute resolution systems is Royal Mail Group, and it's a real privilege to work with the organisation. And I have here with me today Jane Fairhurst, the head of employee relations and industrial relations at Royal Mail. So I'm going to hand Jane over to yourself, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, David, for inviting me. Good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to start with is just a little bit of background to Royal Mail. I'm sure most of you do know us, and I'm sure our postmen come up your path every day. But just to put a little bit of context into us as a business, basically within Royal Mail, we are an organisation of about 137,000 people. Obviously, it's a national organisation. We're hugely unionised, so we have a very strong union presence with our direct workforce, which is the postmen and women that you meet on a daily basis, which is the CWU, and our management is unionised with Unite. So the whole workforce is unionised. A little bit of where we've been going over the last 2 years. We were a public company, and we knew we were moving into privatisation. So to move into privatisation, we realised as a business we had to make quite a lot of changes. So work started probably about 18 months before privatisation, which is when I first met up with the TCM group, with looking at different approaches for the strategy of the business. So to get us through privatisation, we needed to work very closely with our unions. And one of the things that we brought through, partly through a pay deal, but also to help us step over into the privatised world, was an agreement called the Agenda for Growth. This really was looking at our future strategy. And what we were looking for there was, in total, industrial stability was what we needed as a business. And you may all remember in 2009, that's something we didn't have as an organisation. So that was hugely important for us to have that industrial stability. Some of the things that we needed to then give to our unions was some legal protections, so that they actually got the respect that we weren't about to carve up this business and take the big bucks and do a runner. So we worked very closely with our unions to come up with an agreement which gave 6 different things, but the main things were around cultural change, some legal protections for our employees, a 3-year pay award which actually gave that stability as well around pay, and some ongoing programs of work which were major things that we needed to change within the business, but we would absolutely focus on. And some of that was around, one of those programs of work was taking initiation to train 10,000 of our managers and union reps jointly, and that was to start them looking at how do they work together, how do they communicate, which was a starter into how were we going to actually start to progress into mediation within the business. So within Royal Mail, the first thing we did way before privatisation was to focus on our bullying and harassment policy, which it's been interesting hearing what people are saying around policies. Our bullying and harassment policy definitely took people straight into formal dispute. Nobody talked to one another, and as David pointed out, they came to the end of that policy and you were right and I was wrong. And this was really something that we decided was not something we wanted in our new culture going forwards. The policy was first written with very much the belief that we needed to go into informal situations prior to going into the formal process. So we actually started looking at companies and researching what was out there to help and move forward with this. And this was where I was introduced to TCM Group. Now, what we looked at there was getting the right partnership. And on the slide, you'll see that I'm saying this is a joint project. We actually brought the unions straight into the room with us. We had both unions and management and our stakeholders through the business, where we sat down and looked at what we wanted from the company we were going to work with. We did a stringent process of elimination where we had shortlisting. We went down to 6 companies who came and presented to all of us. And the main thing for me with TCM was the fact that they actually wanted to get to know our business and understand actually how did we work and what were the issues that we were facing, and actually partner that. So they wouldn't move from the model that they work with, which is a tried and tested model, and we didn't want them to do that. What we wanted was somebody who could come in and help us and actually educate us on how and when to bring mediation into the business. The B&H policy was really our trial. We knew that this was something that we could actually contain. We knew the size of the problem that it was going to be. With the help of TCM, we understood how big the issue was going to be, how many people, how many cases would be taken up in the first year. And I'll go on to some of those stats a little bit later on. So we started to trial that a year ago, and it has proved very successful. We haven't actually marketed it in the business at all. What we do when positions come in, when we have a dispute come into our shared service, we then look at the situation. If it's appropriate for mediation, mediation is at that point then sold and offered. At this stage, we haven't started marketing the mediation because we wanted to keep it quite contained so we could actually start to look at, is it working and what are we getting back from it, rather than just doing a broad brush, anybody can have it. We then actually came to an agreement last January, and in that agreement we then started looking at how we could introduce mediation into our industrial relations framework. So within a company our size, obviously, just to give you an idea of what that is, where there is issues within the business, the union and the management have a framework in which they can raise these issues at 3 stages to try and get them resolved. And as has been said already today, what that actually encourages is that the people at the local level don't deal with that. What they do is escalate it to stage 2, which goes up to the next level of management and union, and then up to stage 3. So now you've got directors dealing with actually very small individual matters. So we really needed to have a look at that, and that was something that was going to be introduced in the Agreement of Agenda for Growth. But what we started to do was work probably a good 6 months beforehand with TCM to look at how we were going to deal with this. Part of that work that David and his entire team helped us with was to look at identifying whether it should be an internal team or an external team, what a job description would look like for an internal mediator, what were the skills that were going to be required, how would it actually be designed within our organisation so that when people did have issues, how they would come to get a mediator, which sounds quite basic, but when you've got 137,000 people, this is a tanker that we're trying to turn. It's not actually a speedboat. So you can imagine there was quite a lot of work that went along with that. So looking at the kind of long-term success, the overarching objective was to reach agreement at the lowest possible level. So that was one of the things that we really highlighted, that, as I think Jonny mentioned, because this was a really great policy that we had for dealing with industrial relations issues, what it did was stick it straight into a framework that just escalated it and nobody actually dealt with it. What we wanted to do was push that right down to the lowest level so that we had things where we had issues where people started to work together, they started to listen to each other's views. They wanted to actually seek solutions at that lowest level, which actually was where the impact was going to be, not by the director saying, just get on with it. This was where the issues were. We needed to look at how we could engage these people into talking about really what the issue was. And we had suspicions that actually it wasn't an actual industrial relations issue. It was actually a relationship issue. And this could be 2 people who had worked together for 20 years, only spoke to each other when conflict occurred. So they actually had a pretty bad relationship, but they didn't know how to take that forward at any point. So the real cultural change for us was about getting that actual objective to reach agreement at the lowest level. Before I move on to the stats, what we have, just so you're aware of what we did eventually do, we then decided that, mediation was the way forward within the business, and it was something as I said, we started trialling in the B&H. It seemed to be slow at first to pick up, but where it was picking up and people were using it, it was really, really successful. In fact, I think on our figures within our business, we're hitting, especially in the B&H, definitely hitting the 90% success rate. And I think this month we're up to 92% success rate within our B&H cases. So within the industrial relations side, we decided that to actually even embed it further within our cultural change, we wanted our own full-time internal team. So we went through a very stringent recruitment program where we were looking at having 10 mediators who actually work in pairs, and 5 of them would actually be from the union, so they were union reps, and 5 of them will be from our management grades, so that when we went out to do the mediations, we had complete impartiality, so that they worked together. And as time has gone on, nobody knows which one's which, whether it's a union rep or a manager, which is absolutely great. So we actually have our team of 10, cementing our relationship with TCM and absolutely making sure that we keep that impartiality and the best practice. We've actually seconded one of David's employees into the business, who is working with us on a secondment, and he actually manages the team. And I think that's giving great insight to TCM from a point of view of working with a massive organisation to see some of the issues that we face once we've set these things up. But also it gives us that absolute expertise that we need to make sure that we are running an absolutely top-notch internal mediation team. On the bullying and harassment, we have left that external, and we use TCM mediators as and when is required for the right cases. So we're using a real mix within the business, which at the moment we think is the right way to keep going. Few of the stats. B&H last year we had 56 referrals with 42 agreements, and that's up to the end of last month. That's about 22% of cases that have gone through into mediation. When we first started working with David on the models, he was kind of like, you can expect about 25%, Jane. So we think, to be honest, that at 22%, with no marketing of this and not really pushing this forward, that we're on about the right scale. We did work with TCM on the cost. Within our model, we believed that any bullying and harassment case that went into the formal process, so didn't go into mediation, if that took us up to 35 days to deal with that was costing us as a business circa £4,500. If it went over 35 days, that was circa £12,000. And if it actually got to a point where it hadn't been resolved through the formal site and it went into a tribunal situation, dare I tell you that it goes to over £120,000 per case. Some of those figures we used, David has a fantastic calculator where you can put in there how much management time is taken, putting in sick leave. We actually used some of our live cases to get the averages so that we could look at that. So we believe so far in the first year, we have saved ourselves quite a considerable amount of money. The IR mediation went live in August. Now, obviously, we had to do all of the training. So, TCM did all of the training with our mediators. We then actually set this up like a mini little basically business within Royal Mail. So we had to set everything up from scratch. We did some mediations prior to Christmas, but actually I would say the main cases that have come in really in earnest have been from January. So up until this point we've done 26 cases. We have 24 agreements in place. So we're working on probably we're over 90% within the IR mediation. There's complete union engagement within this, as I say. It's managed by TCM manager, who we've seconded in, but we manage Thomas, our manager, jointly with the CWU. So Thomas reports into both the union and myself, which is quite interesting. But I think what that gives us is that we talk from the top. There always has to be that relationship. Okay, just some of our impact. You can see on the screens, the mediation service is viewed as a beacon of the impartiality, which I mentioned. Mediation parties promote the use of mediation. We do that nationally. We've gone to national events. We go around the country now. So we're really marketing our services in the IR framework. The next step for us is to start to market B&H a little bit more. But we're just starting to look at how this is going to work within our grievance policy. We're going to rewrite the grievance policy, which I think is the right thing to do, and we're going to put mediation right through the heart of it and how that's going to hopefully help moving forward. This is already showing us a massive cultural change. We're starting to see, and some of the comments that we get back, are local reps and managers who say after one day with our mediators, they've started to talk more than they have done in 20 years, the entire time that they've worked within the business. We've had 2 people who haven't spoken at work, only under conflict, for 2 years, actually got up at a national management forum and stood on the stage and told everybody, really, this was the most amazing thing that they had ever been to. I think it was quite an accolade that they actually travelled down together on the train and then stayed in the same hotel. Obviously, they had their own rooms to disappear back to, but we went down to have a drink with them, and we couldn't believe the change in 2 individuals. So from a business, it's still very new for us. But at the moment, what I would say is that we are just getting such great feedback, and it really is definitely making inroads into a cultural change that we as a company, the tanker we are, absolutely needs.
It's absolutely inspiring, and just that story at the end of the 2 people travelling down to tell their story at the Ops and Mods conference, which, by the way, is an absolutely massive conference at the NEC. And not being there, but my understanding is they had everybody was just gobsmacked at the power of this. And there's a debate going on in the questions at the moment. So there's lots of questions coming up around policies and procedures and flexibility of procedures. So Lee, you've been asking questions about policies and procedures. I'll just go back there. Who else has been asking questions around policies and procedures? So Nicola, you've been talking about making mediation normal. Jenny, talking about is it acceptable to use procedures before initiating policies and procedures. Let's remind ourselves of these policies and procedures. They have a really important part to play, but they're inflexible. They're a one-size-fits-all approach. The root cause of conflict, I've talked about loss, giving rise to perceptions, feelings, hopes, fears, needs, goals, aspirations. I think what you're doing, Jane, I'd be interested to know your thoughts, is you're actually bringing some humanity back to the process and saying, yes, our policies and procedures are important, but you, our employees, are equally as important, and we recognise that you have the capacity to resolve your own issues. And it seems to me that you're putting real trust and confidence in your people to resolve their own problems. And I'd be interested to know your thoughts on why you've done that, and are you finding that your employees do have the capacity to resolve their own problems?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the policies that we had were very traditional. They were very formal, and for some people, that the capacity is that that's what they trust and that's what they're going to use. So this isn't going to, I don't believe, at this stage change everybody to going, yes, mediation's for me. But it's voluntary. It's also, it's how you discuss it with the individuals, because people don't actually understand what it is.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely about letting them know what it is that they're going to go through, how that's going to help them. And once you do that, it's amazing how many people just actually do want to resolve it themselves. I think Jonny put in his presentation about the amount of people who actually go and talk to the individual themselves or go to the manager. Well, this is actually doing that, but what you're doing is putting a bit of a safety blanket around it. So in that mediation, they learn the tools with an independent third party of how to deal with that. So the next step in the cultural change is that actually they've got some of those tools to go and talk to that individual themselves. Yeah. So the longer term is you're actually changing the culture right at the bottom. Yeah. You've not got the chief executive going, we're going to have a cultural change here where everybody deals with everything at the local level. So it enhances the policies, and it doesn't have to be an either or. You can insert, we've put mediation in at every stage of the B&H policy, so that they're offered it at the beginning. If they don't feel confident enough to accept it at that stage, but they get halfway through, they can draw on mediation at that point.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's really important, there's questions coming through here, Joe. I know we've got time because this is a phenomenally interesting area, but people often think about the role of the manager and the leader as a mediator. And, you know, is this just a bit pink and fluffy and a bit soft and cuddly? And, you know, we've got due process, and then there's these other weird and wonderful things, medication or meditation, mediation. We get very confused, don't we? And I often say to people, look, this is actually a really important key function of effective leadership, wherever that leadership might be. And it's not just about creating a bridge of dialogue and communication between our two parties, but what can also happen in that space is the parties start to identify failings in system, in process, in some of the ways that we're working. Now, we could spend thousands of pounds on Lean Six Sigma gurus to come into our organisations and do business process re-engineering and tell us what we already know. Or we can get two warring parties in a distribution centre or a depot to sit down in a room, and they'll tell us what isn't working. And what's really fascinating in mediation is they'll tell us what isn't working, and then it's their responsibility to go away and put it right. So it's not just about restoration of relationships, it's about driving innovation and actually building more stronger organisations, more stronger structures, systems, processes, and ultimately the culture.
Absolutely. And some of the things that you will find, and we're finding already, that actually at the local level they're embracing this and they are starting to make decisions and talk. Now, we now have to manage at the senior level. There is a little bit of, well, I'm not sure I like this because they've just made a decision. So you've got to work at all levels to get your senior managers to be able to actually lift the gloves off and let them make the decisions.
Absolutely.
Because that's a shock to the system for them. But what I love is that the people at the local level are coming up with ideas and solutions that are purely, it's their idea and their solution, and they own it. And when we walk away from our day of mediation, our internal mediators walk away, or the TCM mediator from the B&H walks away, what actually happens is that they have something that they own, and they are then responsible to take that forward. That's a huge change for people's mindsets.
It is. One of my fondest memories of working with yourself over the last 12 months, there's many fond memories, but one of them was at the first started working with you, meeting with Moya Green within a couple of days of securing the contract, working with Royal Mail. I remember meeting with Moya Green, yourself and Mike Newby, and Moya was absolutely clear. This is at the heart of the modern Royal Mail for the future. And that wasn't hyperbole. That wasn't a nice leadership mantra and, you know, we'll go away and do it and nothing changes. That has fed through the organisation at all levels. And I think that's really become clear to me. Culture starts at the top. It also starts at the bottom. But what you've created in Royal Mail is a meeting of minds between both the senior leadership and elsewhere in the organisation. And I think I commend the work and I really appreciate the case study and the work that's been done. Thank you, Jay. I'm conscious of time. Thank you for sticking with our webinar on conflict management. I'd like to hand over to our third presenter now, Richard Saundry, Associate Professor from Plymouth University, who's also recently published along with his colleague Paul Latray, a detailed report into the role of mediation in a large NHS trust. So if you're there, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm conscious of time. I don't want to put pressure on you, but we're at 1:30. So if you can stay with us, and we'll allow Richard to tell his story and draw out some of the evidence that he's been picking up. So Richard, over to you, and looking forward to some of your thoughts and the reflections on conflict management systems. Thank you very, very much.
Hi, David. Yeah, and hi, everybody. And as David said, we're conscious of time here, so I'll try and be as quickly as possible, and hopefully you can see my slides. I'm just going to, very quickly, what I'm going to try to do is draw on some research that myself and others, including, as David mentioned, Paul Latray from Sheffield University, have been doing over a few years now, but focusing on a recent piece of research we did involving an organisation that David and TCM have done a lot of work with over the last few years. And this research over the last 5 years or so has been published in a variety of different forms, mainly through the ACAS research paper series. Just by way of introduction, one of the things I'm going to be talking about is what are called integrated conflict management systems, which is a very sort of long-winded term perhaps, but that's something which has come out of a lot of research in the US, where integrated approaches to conflict management are much more common than they are in the UK. David mentioned sort of the growth in mediation, and that's certainly the case. But at the moment, research tends to suggest that in the UK we're relatively slow in actually adopting more innovative approaches to conflict management that extend beyond mediation, that include mediation, but go a little bit further than just mediating in specific disputes. The types of approaches we've heard in being used, for example, in relation to Royal Mail and other organisations. And there are a number of barriers which our research over the last few years has suggested. One of the key things is just a failure of many organisations to locate conflict management as a strategic priority. That's still not commonplace within organisations, despite obviously a very clear case for it that we've heard in the discussion today. And secondly, and I'll come back to this in a second, hopefully, managerial resistance and the resistance of line managers quite often to using alternative dispute resolution, and particularly mediation, in a sense that sometimes using mediation and having to call in the mediator is seen in some way as a sense that they failed to deal with an issue in an effective way, and that is still a real barrier in some organisations. Okay, onto the case study. You can read this in much more detail. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. You can either contact me or you can go onto the ACAS website where you can find that report in much greater detail. I'm just going to highlight a few key issues about what Northumbrian Healthcare, or as I mentioned earlier, in association with TCM, have done in terms of managing conflict over the last few years. And there's some key lessons, I think, to be learned from this particular case. Perhaps the most important thing is that within that organisation we found that conflict resolution was linked with health, well-being and also engagement. It wasn't just seen as a way of resolving disputes. Secondly, as we've heard with Royal Mail, the Northumbria Healthcare embarked in quite a radical revision of their policies and procedures, focusing on resolution. So rather than your stereotypical grievance policy, your stereotypical dignity at work policy and procedure, the focus was on trying to resolve issues at an early point, and with mediation a central part of those particular policies and procedures. And like Royal Mail, NHCT, Northumbria Healthcare, is a heavily unionised organisation, so revising those policies and procedures was not necessarily an easy task, but something which is very important. Critically, in the way in which they manage conflict within this organisation, they analyse data. So they analyse where are the hotspots in the organisation, where are the particular problems. They look at grievance data, they look at disciplinary data, absence, stress risk assessment, and they identify where they need to intervene, where they need to actually take some action. They then use a range of approaches, and mediation is just one of those. So they use mediation, stress risk assessment, team facilitation, and also conflict coaching. I know that TCM trained the conflict coaches up at Northumbria Healthcare. So there's a range of different approaches depending on the nature of the issue. But it goes broader than that. And so mediators who've been trained within the organisation are also involved in training line managers, and not just training them in terms of policy and procedure, but training them in terms of conflict resolution skills. And something that is, in my experience as a sort of an employee relations academic, something that is very rare is that conflict management and the importance of it is actually written into their HR strategy. It's not just something that's in the employee relations sphere. It is is a specific stream within the core HR strategy of the organisation, and that's, in my view, fairly critical in terms of why this has been a potential success. So what we went in to do is we went in to look at that, but also look at what the impacts of introducing this system has been in the organisation. One of the key sources of conflict within the organisation was performance management, and quite a lot of bullying and harassment cases arising from attempts by managers to manage performance in a very difficult environment, and employees perceiving that action to be unfair, and therefore there will be the cases, grievances in case of bullying and harassment. The figure there that hopefully you can see shows the response of managers that we surveyed, well over 200 managers in the organisation, as to the costs of conflict. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things on this. Firstly, perhaps not surprisingly, 60% said that conflict resulted in wasted management staff and time. But also, well over a third said that it had an impact on productivity, so on the bottom line of the organisation. And almost 1 in 5 managers said that it compromised the quality of patient care. So that shows that conflict is a core issue within this organisation. It should be mentioned, by the time we came to do this research, and this approach had been in place for a number of years, incidence of disputes in NHCT is well below the public sector average, and the average in terms of the NHS also. So this has become a low conflict organisation. We also found evidence that a strategic approach had been developed. I mentioned the key issues, the key elements of that earlier. The system of conflict management, multiple interventions based on analysis of hard data, which I think is crucial, and the fact that conflict management informed a wider HR strategy. But the results of that can be seen again in that table, which comes from our survey of managers. And these aren't people with a vested interest. These are just operational managers, line managers who are dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. Well over half, 58%, said that the way in which conflict was managed in their organisation was collaborative. And therefore, if you look at the other categories that we tested within the research, what this points to is the fact that within this organisation they had been successful in developing a collaborative approach to dealing with conflict. And this is from line managers, who many sort of researchers and many in the field would say quite often so sometimes the source of the problem in terms of managing conflict effectively. So this is fairly notable stuff. We also found that over time a culture of early resolution had been effectively developed. Training was seen as very positive, and importantly there was a very, very wide awareness and positive attitude to mediation, and certainly more so, and I've done a lot of research recently in organisations, and a much greater awareness and acceptance of the benefits of mediation than at any other organisation in which I've done research. But there were some barriers, and I think it's important to identify this. Is that, and I think in terms of looking at how conflict management can be developed in organisations, we still need to be aware that there are going to be those people who remain unconvinced by this, and certainly the junior managers, those people who were just developing their managerial role, were a little bit less confident. And part of that reason for that was that training was less likely to get to those lower bands of managers as opposed to more senior managers. And they were particularly worried that addressing conflict at an early stage could lead to counter-accusations, could lead them being embroiled within grievance processes, possibly employment tribunals. Those things were still in people's minds. And I think a critical issue is that there's a number of managers argued that there was a lack of time to manage complex issues informally. And a particular issue which came out of this research, which we've noticed in other research we've done in other organisations, is that sometimes informal resolution, so not necessarily mediation, but dealing with things at an early stage, having a conversation with an employee, trying to resolve something right at the lowest point of contact, was sometimes invisible to more senior managers. And there's a quote here from one of the managers which I think is quite useful. This manager said, "Dealing with some conflict between a couple of individuals is really hard to put on paper or to demonstrate that's what you've done. But actually, if I've done that and it's an expectation of my job, somewhere down the line it's going to become an even bigger problem." And that really identifies a key issue, is that for some managers, getting involved in early resolution was not necessarily being noticed, it wasn't therefore necessarily being rewarded, and therefore a key thing for organisations in terms of developing more effective conflict management is to try to ensure that those activities are noticed, they're identified, and they're rewarded when managers try to address conflict in that more creative way, shall we say. In addition, for some managers, and I have to say this is a minority, but for some managers, mediation was still seen as a sign of failure, that actually calling the mediator in was an indication that they'd failed to deal with an issue in an effective way. And secondly, and I think this is a real issue in terms of trying to convince managers that mediation and ADR is a potential way forward, is that there was some concern that mediation could undermine attempts to manage performance. And there's a quote there from a manager who hadn't yet gone through mediation. It should be said that most of the managers that we interviewed in this research and other research previously, when they go through mediation, quite often those attitudes change. But the perception is that mediation is going to do very little to help them deal with an issue where they think there's a matter of and the employee's poor performance is involved. So again, that was a barrier that came out of the research that we did. And finally, and I appreciate I've sort of rushed through this a little bit, but I think what this case demonstrates is it highlights a number of sort of key lessons for organisations looking at using mediation, but more importantly looking at developing strategic approaches to conflict resolution. Firstly, it's critical to identify conflict as a strategic issue that's related to well-being, as David mentioned earlier, related to employee engagement and performance. Secondly, that people management skills more broadly are a core competence. What we find in many organisations in our research is that managers are not appointed, developed, rewarded or promoted because they're good at managing people. And that's what they started to do within NHCT, and I think that's a critical issue. Thirdly, that the active participation of key stakeholders is absolutely crucial, and we had a very good example of that in the case of Royal Mail earlier in the webinar. But also important that conflict management shouldn't necessarily be a preserve of HR. And one of the really fascinating things about the NHCT case was that the mediation service and the broad approach to conflict management was actually located, was managed and championed by occupational health psychologists within the NHC, within the organisation, which gave them a little bit of a distance and an air of impartiality, which they argued made the service much more accessible. Where mediation and conflict management is located fairly and squarely in HR and HR alone, then that, in our experience, can be a little bit of a barrier to take up within the organisation. Fourthly, knowledge is power. One of the key things that this organisation did is they collected data and they used that data to shape their conflict management responses. And again, unfortunately, that's something that we find in many organisations that we go into. That data just isn't collected, and if it is collected, it's not used necessarily in an intelligent way. So that's absolutely critical. And finally, that while mediation is extremely important, and the evidence suggests that mediation is extremely effective in most cases, that conflict management isn't just about mediation, it's about using multiple interventions to address issues in the appropriate way. And in NHCT, one of the key things that they use mediators in a wide range of ways, very flexibly, to respond to specific needs within the organisation. Okay, that's me done.
Richard, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I really like the holistic approach you described at the end of the presentation. It's not just about mediation, but mediation is just a shorthand term for talking and listening, engaging with each other constructively. And I think what we see is, in some respects, it's like a continuum or a spectrum. On one level, it's about face-to-face negotiations, sitting in a room, going for a coffee, having a chat, walking it through. It might be an HR professional having a facilitated conversation, a union professional or a manager. Then, of course, we've got the mediation, internal or external, and there's a wide array of interventions. But what was really fascinating in the presentation really was the word, I didn't hear you use it, but you've referenced it so many times, is the psychological contract. The relationship that exists between our managers and between our employees, the unwritten rules. And you talked there about the core competencies of leaders, about giving leaders the confidence to address these issues. And I think that contract, the psychological contract, is the most important contract that exists in our organisations. And unfortunately, when it goes wrong or gets damaged, I think many people, many managers and leaders just don't have the skills, the confidence, the competence or the courage to address that. I'd just be interested to know your thoughts, Richard. Is it really at that level? Is it all about leadership?
Well, I think the line, the operational manager, is the critical person here, because obviously as HR has developed, then increasingly those responsibilities devolve down to those line and operational managers. And I think that one of the key things that we found in our research is that where organisations really take that on board and pay attention to developing those competencies, then that's where they start to really develop more effective ways of managing conflicts. And I think the critical thing is that training is important, and developing those skills is essential if you're going to improve the way that the organisation manages conflicts. However, you also need to recognise that within the broader ways in which you employ people, with which you develop people, and particularly the way in which you reward people. And what NHCT had started to do, which in my experience is fairly rare, is that they'd decided that they weren't going to necessarily employ senior staff unless they demonstrated they had those sorts of competencies to deal with those types of issues. They weren't just simply going to appoint or promote people because they had a particular technical skill. They wanted their managers to be able to have those conversations and address and resolve those issues. And I think that's something which organisations need to think about more broadly.
Absolutely, and when we were working with the Trust, we were very clear about these are core competence of managers and leaders. And for organisations who are serious about tackling conflict and disputes at work, it isn't just about policies and processes. We're very hung up on policies and processes. It's about starting to focus on what are our values, how are they enshrined in our leadership competences, how do they manifest in our leadership behaviours, how do we reward high performance, how do we train and support our leaders and managers, and create and foster a culture whereby dialogue becomes the norm. And when it goes wrong, we don't just then go into some formal process and throw the book at people. We actually sit down and using coaching or mentoring and mediation and that whole approach to put things right again. And that's, I think, what the Trust have done. And I think the report is an absolutely fantastic read. It's so interesting. I did send it out to the majority of people registered for the webinar. If you haven't received that report, I will send the link out again after this session. But for now, Richard, I could carry this conversation on for hours, but I'm conscious we don't have hours. So I'm going to say a huge thank you, Richard, and thank you, very, very much appreciated. Thank you. So we're going to draw the session to a conclusion now. But we've got two words up here in front of us: resolution and grievance. You've probably got a grievance procedure. Most organisations do. Formal, adversarial, defensive. It's about blame. It's about right and wrong. It's about winners and losers. Many organisations now, large banks, large local authorities, hospitals, and others are now introducing resolution policy. By the way, it's not removing grievance, it's reframing grievance. And conflict's about language, semantics, vernacular. Let's get it right. Let's bring it in line with our modern organisation's values and our vision, our goals, our objectives. It's about informality, safety, empathy, resolution, non-adversarial approaches, win-win, collaboration. Surely that language is more aligned to the kind of businesses we want to be. Why do we have this anachronistic terminology when people get into dispute? It doesn't match what I think organisations tell me they want to be. So after the webinar, I will send you out a copy of the model resolution policy. It's there for you to use and work through as you wish. I think work unions, we've heard from the Royal Mail experience and from the presentation from Richard, unions management working together to promote resolution approaches, creating safe spaces for dialogue. We promote heavily early triage processes, HR getting in early and trying to identify the most effective route to resolution. Let's stop leaving it to the last minute and focus at an earlier stage. Promoting early resolution and mediation, we had a number of questions about cultural change. And one of the issues for me is we have to start somewhere, and let's make mediation at least a normal thing that we talk about in our business. Let's have a conversation about conflict, a dialogue about disputes. Let's go out and talk about this. It's going to exist. And finally, ensure that your approach is convergent with your core values and align it to your values and continue to monitor and evaluate it. Mediation doesn't have special dispensation. Conflict management does not have special dispensation from any other project you would implement in your business. It needs to be monitored and measured for its effectiveness, and take those reports to the board and let them know the work that's being done. So here are some approaches. There are many approaches. Richard, you talked about this in your presentation. It's not just mediation, neutral evaluations, triaging, facilitated conversations, mediation, team building, coaching, resolution meetings with HR and unions, investigations. There are numbers of these, but what's important is to balance or create a balance and a convergence between the softer, that's the wrong word, I don't think it's softer, the harder skills of dialogue, collaboration and empathy against those harder elements of your policies, which is about punitive or sanction-based approaches and recalibrating our policies. I hope we've answered, there are numerous questions, and let me just try and pick up any more. Jane, you've just mentioned it's about empathy, something we've lost. I would agree we have an empathy deficit. But let's go back and give each other a jolly good listening to. Let's listen for meaning and not listen to defend. Let's try and hear what people are saying and talk to each other like human beings. And then see if that helps us to resolve our issues. Before you leave, I'd be interested to understand if you would start to use greater use of mediation in your organisation as a result of what you've heard. So I'm going to launch a quick poll. It's a yes or no answer. Before we end today, would you use mediation more widely in your organisation as a result of what you've heard today? So yes or no, you should have it in front of you. Will you make greater use of mediation as a result of what you've heard today? I know many of you are using it already, or maybe thinking about it or starting to, but just based on our presentations from Jonny, from Jane, from Richard and myself, will you make better use of mediation as a result? So 50% of you have voted. I'll keep it open for another 10 seconds and then we'll share the outcome. It's not as exciting as the vote that we had a couple of weeks ago, but nonetheless, it's still an exciting vote. Not the X Factor results. No, I was talking about the general election.
Oh yeah, good.
I shall have to remember I'm not on mute. Okay, so I'm going to keep it open for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So just closing the poll, so I'll share that with you now. So 100% of people who've attended today's webinar suggested that they will make a greater use of mediation. So thankfully we haven't put anyone off today, which I suppose is a positive, and I'm very, very keen to support you on your journey of promoting mediation more widely in your organisations. We're a small business, we do fantastic work. I'm not just saying that, you've heard that from others here today. And we can help you in so many ways. We can help you set up a mediation scheme like Royal Mail and Northumbria Healthcare Trust. You don't have to be a big organisation, small organisation, medium, or indeed large ones like Royal Mail. We provide the flagship training for accredited mediators in this country. If you're interested in being trained as a mediator or would like to train a team of in-house mediators, let me know. It's what we do, it's what we're great at, and it's what delivers a real impact. helping you to identify what's working and not working in your organisation. Jane mentioned the conflict calculator. I'd be very happy to share that with delegates today, but we have more detailed diagnostics we run. How engaged are your people? How happy are they? How stressed out are they? What's the cost of conflict? And we run that and provides really valuable data to help you build your business case. Of course, we provide professional mediation services. If you've got a conflict sat on your desk right now and you're thinking, well, what on earth should I do with this? Where should I go? Why don't you ring me? Why don't we have a conversation and see if we can help and see if we can prove how good we are by taking that particular situation off your desk and demonstrating that mediation can work. I did that for an airline, and I remember being brought back to meet the general manager, and he said this to me: what did you put in their coffee, David? So if you'd like to find out what we put in people's coffee, maybe just give us a bit of a ring. And of course, we train managers and leaders. We've seen them today as being a key stakeholder, a key player. We specialise in training managers and leaders to have those tough conversations and to address some of these issues more effectively and build healthier, happier, more resilient workplaces. So thank you so much for listening and participating. Our timekeeping today hasn't necessarily been all that it should be. We're an hour and a half, but wow, what a series of presentations and what a lot of information. This will be typed up and transcribed as an article and as a white paper. It's also going to be available on YouTube. So if you've got anyone else who'd like to know about what we're doing and the role of conflict management and mediation in organisations, then please do share that. But for now, thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions and participating. Thank you so much to our speakers, Jonny Gifford, Jane Fairhurst and Richard Saundry. So I'm David Liddle, I'm the CEO of the TCM Group, and I'd just like to wish you a very happy weekend and, as always, happy mediating. Thank you.